speaker is Dr. Sylvia Bashevkin, whose top title is How Do Women Transform Cities? Sylvia is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, has written extensively about women in municipal restructuring. So, thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you to all the organizers, to the Coast Salish, and thank you to all the younger women who are here, because I think a message I would offer as someone who started studying this field more than 30 years ago is you can try and make a difference as a political scientist as well. So remember that there are many, many streams towards influence. So I'd like us to begin with a question. Whether we can imagine a city where mums who are pushing strollers are welcomed rather than treated like lepers when they get onto a subway or a bus. Where the sidewalks are safe for older women who are walking with canes or walkers, rather than serving as sidewalks, but becoming speedy express lanes for all these impatient young men on skateboards and bicycles. Can you imagine a city where city planners and municipal leaders actually gender their citizens in public rhetoric by referring to women transit users and women pedestrians and women joggers in parks? If you can dream this far, I would suggest you're well on your way towards winning one of the best practices prizes from Women Transforming Cities. You are a best practices world star. Or if you live in cities other than Vancouver or Calgary, or some other beacon of hope in our times, you must be like me. You must be a serial optimist, or perhaps you are a delusional optimist, and you insist on seeing the glass half full when it arguably has a gaping hole in the bottom. So what do we know from political research about these questions? First of all, we know that concerned and vocal and mobilized local citizens do make a difference. We also know from political research that individual public leaders matter. They matter for doing good and, unfortunately, for doing damage. And third, we know that mobilized citizens and individual leaders together can shape municipal jurisdictions at least as much, if not more so, than at the national and the international levels. Fourthly, we know that the history of women in cities in Canada is one of promise and achievement and opportunity. We have an uplifting history, an uplifting story that dates in particular from the Industrial Revolution and the chances that urban settings provided to individual women and girls, many of them were immigrants, and offered them chances to break free of their families and the religious strictures that were very powerful in rural Canada and small town North America generally. After all, cities were where so many women had the chance to break down the barriers that faced them in those smaller places. It allowed them to work for pay, to attend university, to demand the right to vote, to demand the right to public office, to run as public servants, to enter the professions like medicine and law, to create a broad variety of social reforms that are with us today, much of what we're so proud of in our cities that we talk about, like public libraries and pure food and drug laws and child labor laws. These are the legacies of social feminism, of the first wave of feminism or suffragism in this country. In fact, we can argue that so many significant social changes that came out of the progressive period in Canadian history are in fact crucial legacies of our identity. In other words, of the proud history of urban women in this country. And I think we need to embrace that when we think about challenges for the future, that we have a tremendous foundation upon which to build. In my remarks today, I'd like to focus on returning to the momentum that was once the wind at the backs of progressive women activists and women public leaders in cities across Canada, because we do have the opportunity to go back to a very proud legacy. For me, the contrast between the inspiring background and our current predicament is all too stark. In Toronto, where I have lived and worked for more than 35 years, we find an unprecedented crisis of both citizen mobilization and local political leadership. We know that even the late-night talk show hosts in the United States know about the second problem. And they generally know nothing about Canada, right? We're that blank space on a weather chart. Anyway, the recognize the links between the two challenges, however. Permit me to point out, in terms of a link, that more than a year ago, the Deputy Mayor of Toronto told reporters that one of the most crucial problems in the city was that voters routinely elected opponents of his ally, Mayor Rob Ford. The Deputy Mayor of Toronto said, on the record, and I quote, "My advice to the taxpayer would be don't send us any more activists. Don't send us any more unionists. Don't send us any more cyclists. Send us some people down here with good common sense who just want to manage the city's affairs. That's what's needed." End of quotation. Now, what can we say about a civic leader who portrays citizens in a narrow, impoverished, and depoliticized way as taxpayers, who wants his colleagues on city council to, quote, manage the city's affairs, rather than to create a better urban environment, rather than to create a strengthened civic fabric in a place that is, after all, the destination of choice for about half the new immigrants to Canada? What can we say about a deputy mayor who literally denigrates the choices made by citizens who take the time and energy to vote in elections? And they are, after all, unfortunately, a minority of the eligible voters. At one level, I would argue that statements of this variety constitute a tragic commentary on the wizened state of urban democracy in our times. They are particularly regrettable, in my view, given that the deputy mayor's comments to the media drew minimal critical response during the more than 13 months that they have stood on the public record. In fact, I kept that quotation in a file, hoping that it would just be, targeted, but I've never heard anybody actually take it on. On another plane, the state of Canada's largest city can inspire us to seek out better examples elsewhere, because we all need to pursue hope and light in the darkness. I want to propose today that the unprecedented crisis of both citizen mobilization and political leadership in our largest city in this country demands that all Canadians concentrate attention on finding ways to transform cities so they are better in the future than they are at present. I want to provide 5 modest suggestions that can make cities better for the majority of our urban citizens, who, after all, are women and girls, who are on average earning less than men living in urban areas, and who are therefore more dependent on public amenities, such as public transportation, public parks, and the planning of public spaces, than men citizens. First, a modest suggestion. Can we align public infrastructure in advance with proposed private development? A revolutionary question. We have far too much of the reverse, which is backwards and fundamentally corrosive of any sense of a meaningful, fulfilling urban experience. From my own daily commute, I can say that my local subway station in Toronto was built to accommodate very, very few users. It has 1 narrow escalator, often out of service, 1 narrow staircase for both exit and entry, and they lead to 1 corner of a 4-corner intersection. That station is now completely overcrowded and dangerous because we have had 0 entry or exit changes despite the construction of massive numbers of townhouses and condominiums, of course, in Condo City, in that area. We have new cranes on the skyline, and they mean the situation is only going to deteriorate. Is there no basic fire regulation, I ask as a subway user? Is there no basic fire regulation, for example, that is being violated by this lack of municipal foresight? Second question. Perhaps we could insist that talk about pedestrian alternatives to cars, buses, and subways becomes more than just hot air. We have cities, and I live in one, that forces walkers into the street because some developer has been allowed to build hoardings that take over the sidewalk and that remain on the sidewalk year after year. This is fundamentally violating the rights of everyone but the condo builders. We have heavy trucks idling with all their noise, belching diesel fumes, blocking the areas where people need to walk, we have a far from pedestrian, heavenly situation. In short, can we think about making urban pedestrian alternatives safe and walkable? After all, how can we be pedestrians if we can't walk there? And possibly even pleasant. Third question. Could we think about ensuring that police officers enforce sidewalk safety as rigorously as they enforce parking bylaws? Is it not more of a civic hazard for squads of young men to race along sidewalks on bikes and skateboards, endangering everyone in their path, and particularly elderly women? Is it not more of a civic hazard for those guys to be racing along the sidewalks than it is for a car to be parked in a rush hour clearance zone? From my observations over more than 35 years, the deployment of enormous resources to ticket and tow cars that linger 5 minutes into rush hour stands in bold contrast to the willful neglect of sidewalk safety, which is particularly significant, I want to emphasize, in a population that's aging and where we know there are 2 women for every man after the age of 80, which is where the vulnerability on the sidewalks, I think, becomes particularly crucial. A fourth revolutionary question. Could we require that plans for childcare centers be considered in all proposed commercial and residential construction projects? This is done in many cities in other parts of the world, even in the mother country, the UK. If you read the BNA Act, we're supposed to be modeling ourselves on the UK. Anyway, if integration is seen as not feasible, because people say, well, there'll be no children living on the premises. Why? Because, I don't know, it's a senior citizen's home or something. Or there'll be no children coming in because the parents who work there don't want to bring their kids to work. At least let's force a public conversation. Let's force that conversation to occur so that we can create acceptable parameters for justifying either the inclusion or exclusion of daycare spaces in every new commercial and residential construction site. Right now, from my observations, we have wheeler-dealer approaches in many cities in Canada, and these violate our rights as citizens to know what is going on. And P.S., of course, we never are quite told why couldn't there be a child care center in that property? Fifth question, could we demand that municipal election campaigns talk about transportation, planning, housing, childcare, and policing in ways that are explicitly gendered? Could we help to accomplish this, perhaps, by pressing journalists to cover the stories we want to hear about? By nominating and electing more progressive politicians who are prepared to act on our agendas? Of course, by holding more conferences like this one. That would move things forward in a very big way. Now, if we look back to the period immediately following the forced amalgamation of Toronto with its various boroughs, and the renewal of local democracy in Britain's largest city, which followed the election of a new Labour government in 1997. In that period, I undertook a comparative study of women's civic engagement in Toronto and London. Now, we know Toronto's first amalgamated mayor in the mid-1990s was Mel Lastman, and the first leader of the Greater London Authority was Ken Livingstone. Now, I would argue that outside a science laboratory, it would be harder to find a sharper contrast. As a social scientist, it's very hard to control the lab, but here I had a controlled laboratory experiment. So my analysis, which was reported in a volume called Tales of Two Cities, found significant differences in the opportunities for women's representation that were directly attributable to the nature of mayoral leadership in post-amalgamation Toronto and post-democratic renewal London. The differences included, first, the presence in Ken Livingstone's London of bureaucratic units under the mayor's control that were designed to promote and deliver substantively on the policy concerns of women citizens living in London. Under Mel Lastman, we had the complete absence of any such unit in Toronto, and we continue to have the absence of such units in Toronto, even though we've had a number of different mayors since Mayor Lastman. As well, if we look at the comparison between post-amalgamation Toronto and post-reform London, we can see that the attention paid to women's employment, women's housing, childcare, transportation, the attention paid to those substantive policy areas in the Greater London municipal planning discussions and the official planning documents during the Livingston era was significantly more than the total absence of any such attention in the planning documents of post-amalgamation Toronto. In fact, it was very, very hard to find the word women in the entire official planning document of post-amalgamation Toronto. We had no presence, you can argue, complete invisibility of more than a majority of the population. Now, if we had a visitor here from another planet, that person or being might interject at this point that the differences between Ken Livingstone's London and Mel Lastman's Toronto had to do with more than just simply the nature of Ken Livingstone and Mel Lastman. That's certainly true, they had different politics, but there's a lot more going on. We know that there are institutional factors that shape what being a mayor means. We know that there's an important structural dimension to the situation, namely the mayor of Toronto and the mayors of most Canadian cities are highly constrained relative to the mayor of London. Mayors of most Canadian cities are highly constrained in fiscal terms, in jurisdictional terms, and in electoral terms. And we know that we're often reminded that they have limited money, they have limited power, and they often have an unwieldy reliance on suburban voters who, as we know, tend to care more about low taxes than they do about the quality of life in inner cities. But we also know that dating back to the late 19th century, mobilizing urban citizens has been crucial to pushing back against these political constraints. Because it's not clear that mayors of Canadian cities in the age of first-wave feminism, for example, were significantly more powerful than they are right now. We know from volume after volume, in fact, of cross-national urban political research that the most consistently engaged groups in an economically dynamic local scene, such as we find in contemporary Toronto and many other places in this country, the most consistently engaged groups are the commercial interests, notably property developers. We know from the comparative urban research that these interests work day to day, week by week, year after year, to maximize their economic returns, both their current returns and their future returns. And as a result, we know the priorities of the public more generally, and particularly the sorts of policies that matter to youth, to working women, to sexual orientation minorities, to Aboriginal peoples and immigrants, who form crucially distinctive components of our urban populations. These concerns, these priorities, can fall by the wayside because the most mobilized and the most motivated segment of the urban population comprehends each of these groups, including ourselves, as market niches, not as citizens of a democratic polity, because that's the nature of that interest. That's how they see us. You might ask, what changes could raise the stature of the broader public considerations on the municipal agenda? And again, if we turn to the comparative research, we can see here evidence that mayors and members of city council can insist on including a wider set of considerations in urban decision making. And they can do this despite the hue and cry that comes from critics. After all, Ken Livingstone wasn't universally adored in London, and he did push back against the interests that opposed his agendas. Permit me to conclude with a brief example. If we look at London, England during the Ken Livingstone years, we see a recognition that women working for pay were on average far more dependent on public transportation than their male counterparts. And this underpinned Mayor Livingstone's promise, and the promise of London generally in their 2002 official plan, to build 2 new cross-city rail lines, which are under construction. 2 new cross-city rail lines, increase bus capacity by 40%, impose congestion charges on cars entering inner London. And they pushed back and they insisted on doing this in part to pay for the infrastructure investments and in part to open up space for more buses. So there was a lot of pushback, but they went ahead and they made things happen. 10 years later, living in Toronto, I have yet to hear an official voice at the mayoral level or in the planning realm speak to transportation as a basic matter of fairness for more than half the city's population, namely women, vast numbers of whom are working for a living. I'll conclude here. I look forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you.